Today on Blue 58, the Packers didn't do a full teardown and rebuild at running back this offseason, but they came pretty darn close. What will all their investments buy them this season?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I am your host, John Meerdink, and I'm happy to be with you here for another episode talking running backs today. I enjoy the running back preview every year. I enjoy when we do running backs for NFL draft stuff. I just enjoy talking about running backs. And I think it's partly because of the era of football that I really grew up watching. And I mean, like grew up. But when I first started to become aware of more than just the basics of football, the early 2000s were a great time to be watching because of all the running back stuff going on. There's a couple years after Barry Sanders hung him up, but you can kind of group him into that, even though he called it quits, 1998. But Marshall Faulk, Priest Holmes, Amon Green, Jamal Lewis. It's a long list. There was a lot of great running backs in that time of football. LaDainian Tomlinson, throw him out there too. It was a great time to be watching football because of what they did on a weekly basis. You'd watch the Packers game, 2003, Amon Green putting up his record-setting year for the Packers, nearly 1,900 yards. You'd watch him run and think, wow, incredible. Look at the game that he had. And then you'd look up the stats or catch the highlights later, and somebody else, Priest Holmes, LaDainian Tomlinson, somebody else would have an even more incredible game than even he did. And just seeing those duels play out really shaped some of my early appreciation of football, and I think it carries forward to today. And I get all the stuff on running backs and how they've changed and the valuation of the position, and I understand all that, but there's just something almost primordial about a great running back or a great running attack. It's just the most base part of your football brain that's like, watch the offensive line work and watch this incredibly athletic, powerful runner tear through an open hole, shake a linebacker at the second level, bowl over a defensive back, and stroll into the end zone. In some ways, that's about as good as it gets in football. And running backs who can do that kind of thing are always going to be rare and special. How you use them might change, but the guys that can really do that are always going to be fun, and they're always going to be a key part of the offenses in which they play. And that kind of brings us to the Packers, who are trying to do something with their running back room that is, well, a little bit different than what other teams have done of late. The Packers clearly value running backs, and Brian Gutekunst clearly has a type. Right now, the Packers have 6 running backs on their roster. Throw in Henry Pearson, they've got 7, who's a fullback. But none of the 6 running backs on their roster are under 215 pounds. 3 weigh 223 pounds or more. Brian Gutekunst wants mass movers, and maybe he's been listening to Blue 58's draft stuff for a while because that's the thing that we always talk about. We want guys that can move a large body of mass quickly. That's what speed score all comes down to. How quickly can you run at a heavier weight than you might expect? Is that a good idea? From a roster building perspective, it remains to be seen. Looking for that kind of archetype, a guy who is muscly, heavy, and can run fast, always seems like a pretty good idea. But the Packers are going kind of all in on that archetype. And whether or not that is a good idea, I think is an open question. I've asked roster building questions before, kind of looking for some physical diversity within a position group. My theory on that is that if everybody kind of plays the same way, you're easier to stop. There's no change of pace right now in the Packers' backfield. Just speed-wise, there probably is. Marshawn Lloyd is fast enough to be a sort of change of pace back, but style of play should all be essentially pretty similar. That said, if this is the style that you want to play, maybe there's something to the idea of just hitting that archetype really, really hard. We're going to have Josh Jacobs and A.J. Dillon and Marshawn Lloyd and Emmanuel Wilson, and they're all going to be these relatively beefy backs that run hard in a straight line. We're gonna pound away with a bunch of big-bodied backs and see how that works, because that's what we think is the right way to do it. From a running perspective, well, they're committed. And committing to, not really committing to the bit, committing to an idea, I think has some value too. So whether or not it's a good idea to build your entire running back room out of the same kind of running back, at least you're committing to an idea. This is how they think running backs should be, and they're spending resources to make sure that they get those guys. So what is it going to get them? We're going to talk about it. Let's see what we've got with these running backs in 2024. A couple guys in the no expectations camp. Again, our 4-tier preview style. No expectations, low, moderate, high expectations. You can probably guess pretty easily who's going to fall into those camps, though there may be one surprise for you here. A couple guys in the no expectations room, Jarvion Howard and Ellis Merriweather. Well, 3 of them, I guess. We'll throw Henry Pearson in there, too. Howard, an undrafted free agent from this spring. You talk about mass movers, he is one. In his pre-draft process stuff, he ran a 4.5 240 at 219 pounds. That is a speed score of 104.5. Anything over 100 is good. 104.5, easily clearing that bar. Had a very long college career. The pandemic screwed things up for him. He missed an entire season due to that, but now he's on an NFL roster heading to camp. I think there's a chance he could push one of the other lower-level guys. It's just he's a little bit behind the 8 ball because he's the only new face other than Marshawn Lloyd in the running back room this year, and I guess Josh Jacobs too. Only rookie in the running back room this year. Only guy who hasn't been with the Packers before other than Marshawn Lloyd. And the difference between a 3rd-round pick and an undrafted free agent, you don't need me to explain the situation he's in there. The chances of him beating out somebody like Marshawn Lloyd are slim to none. He's going to have to snipe off somebody else if he wants to get to the 53-man roster, though the practice squad could be an option there. Other no expectations guys, Ellis Merriweather, he signed with the practice squad in November but never appeared in a game. I would put him ahead of Howard in our discussion, and I have, just because he's been around a little bit. In terms of measurables, Howard is probably better. He had better college stats. I think he's probably a better athlete, but Merriweather may be a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of fitting into the offense. Though you never know. Offenses change every year, too. I just want to mention Henry Pearson. We don't need to do a deep dive on fullback stuff. He had a tiny, tiny role last year, appeared in 2 games, played 11 snaps on offense, and I didn't write it down, but I think it was 15 snaps on special teams. Didn't play a lot, but did appear in 2 games. I don't know what to make of having a fullback on the roster. I don't know if he's playing a position the Packers still even really want anymore. I do think they probably do. But who's going to fill that role remains to be seen. Maybe Pearson actually has a pretty clear path to the roster with Josiah DeGuara not around anymore. Or maybe Matt LaFleur wants to go away from lead blocker sort of sets, or maybe A.J. Dillon ends up doing that. I don't think that's probably true, but we'll talk about that here in a second. But I don't know what to make of the fullback role in the Packers offense right now, or if Pearson has a real shot at the roster, so I think no expectations is a pretty good place for him. Emmanuel Wilson comes to us next, made the roster last year after a very productive preseason. Packers ended up with 4 running backs on their initial 53-man roster. He hurt his shoulder midway through the season, went on injured reserve, then came back for the playoffs. Had 13 touches in 2 postseason games, 12 carries, 1 catch, more than I would have expected just remembering, but he was part of running out the clock against the Cowboys and got a couple of carries or touches against the 49ers as well. So he was around and playing meaningful games for the Packers there in the postseason. Nonetheless, low expectations, I think, for Wilson. A couple reasons why. First, he's fairly limited as a player. He's not an overwhelming athlete, has never been a big burst or measurables type. He does fit the archetype really well. He is a bigger-bodied back, straight-ahead sort of charger. Unfortunately, the depth chart has changed ahead of him. The Packers didn't just move on from Aaron Jones. They basically tried to make a one-to-one replacement. So Wilson doesn't move up the depth chart at all. It's not like they just drafted Marshawn Lloyd and A.J. Dillon's going to be the de facto number 1 back until Lloyd takes over and Wilson moves up behind them. They brought in Josh Jacobs, who pushes everybody back down behind where Aaron Jones would have been. So he doesn't have a huge opportunity to move ahead. And as such, I think there's a ceiling on his path to playing time. He's probably not going to be taking snaps away from A.J. Dillon. He's probably not going to take away snaps from Marshawn Lloyd, and he almost certainly isn't going to be taking snaps away from Josh Jacobs. So you can see where it's a pretty narrow path to the roster there for Emmanuel Wilson. That said, we should mention he did make it as a fourth-string running back last year. So how does he meet expectations then? He's just got to hang around, await an opportunity, and be ready when it strikes. We probably said pretty similar things about him last year. I did not go back to my notes and talk about Emmanuel Wilson or take a look at what we said about Emmanuel Wilson last year about this time. But the circumstances are pretty much the same. Last year, the Packers' depth chart was pretty well established too. You had Aaron Jones at the top, obviously, A.J. Dillon behind him, and then Patrick Taylor kicking around as well, who had a lot of utility for the Packers. He could be a solid third back. He had a lot of special teams value. It looked like it was going to be some tough sledding for Emmanuel Wilson if he wanted to make the roster. And then what does he do? He just plays really well in the preseason, and the Packers decide they need to keep 4 backs on the roster, and there you go. There's Emmanuel Wilson. A similar path to the roster could unfold for him this year. I mean, things really go sideways for a couple guys ahead of him, an injury, a really bad preseason performance. Say Marshawn Lloyd has some noteworthy fumble issues or had some noteworthy fumble issues in college. Say ball security is an issue for him in the preseason. The Packers aren't going to cut a third rounder. Maybe they don't want to move on from A.J. Dillon. Who is the next man up? Well, that position is open there. So whether it's Emmanuel Wilson or Ellis Merriweather or Jarvion Howard, the opportunity could be there. You never know when something is going to open up for you, and Wilson showed he could be Johnny on the spot last year. So if he can do that, there could be a spot for him in Green Bay. I do think he'll be around as we get to predictions here. The Packers do tend to go with the known quantity about as often as not. So if they're just looking to keep a fourth guy around, either on the 53 or on the practice squad, you could probably do worse than Emmanuel Wilson, at least as far as the prediction goes. You might be in pretty good shape if you assume he's just going to beat out the guys that are nominally behind him right now in Merriweather and Howard. That said, if they show any bit of an edge more than what Wilson has, I think the Packers will probably be quick to make a switch. Next up might be our one surprise. Remember, we're talking about guys for whom we have low expectations here. How about A.J. Dillon? I went back and forth on this. Look, we've historically defined low expectations players as guys that are essentially roster filler, guys that you're just counting on not to make your team worse, but you would replace in a second if you had a better option. And I think that seems to be where A.J. Dillon is right now. He's got to be one of our most studied players on the roster, but I couldn't help studying him a little bit more, as prompted by a question from Discord user MacMiller6914. As a reminder, if you want to join our Discord, have discussions about anything and everything that's on your mind. I think we're talking about the different phonetic pronunciations between Swedish and English in the Discord today. We range pretty far there. But head over to patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com. Contribute any dollar amount there, and you'll be able to join the Discord and have discussions about whatever's on your mind, football-related or otherwise. So this question comes from there. MacMiller6914 asks this. I had a question concerning the episode What's on the Line for Matt LaFleur. I really agreed with the point John made about LaFleur and throwing good money after bad with poor performing players at the bottom of the roster. Hot take. There's no better example of this than A.J. Dillon. I can't find the statistic, but I believe he ranks very far down the list in his ability to gain 1 yard. Sure, he has the occasional breakout runs, but he has really been a lackluster running back. If he wasn't such a lovable Packer, I think he would be hated by fans. He wasn't even picked up by other teams and is on an incredibly friendly contract due to his veteran status. I'm super glad that AJ is going to get into the NFL pension plan now because I think he's really been one of the most lovable Packers, but I think he's really been a poorly performing running back when we've needed him. What do you think? Do you agree? Thank you, Mac Miller, for the question there. I have tried to find a way to say that I don't agree with that, but I think I do. I also could not find that exact stat that you're referring to, but I think it broadly keeps with our perception of A.J. Dillon over the years, in that he hasn't really lived up to his billing as this sort of big-bodied, power straight-ahead back. And those big runs that you reference him breaking every so often really don't actually happen that often. We track explosive plays as a part of our research for thepowersweep.com. Dillon has never really been an explosive back. Last season, even playing as few games as Aaron Jones did, he still had more explosive plays than Dillon did, 11-10. And 11, as a matter of fact, is Dillon's career high back in 2022, is not breaking off explosive plays all that often. Just for comparison, in 2022, Aaron Jones had more than twice as many. More than twice as many. He had 24 to Dillon's 11. In a down year in 2021, Jones had 17. And then back in 2020, he had 22. And the year before, 26. Consistently more explosive. Dillon's explosive ability is roughly comparable to Romeo Doubs, who had 10 and 11 the last 2 years, respectively, 22 and then 23. Doubs is not counted upon for regular big plays, and Dillon produces them about as frequently, even though the bar for most of his explosive plays is lower. The bar for running explosive plays is 12 yards. For receiving, it's 16. Dillon just is not that explosive of a player. And I think looking at it a little bit more broadly, Dillon, since he was drafted in 2020, has always been a little bit more of an idea than a player. And I think the idea is a good one. He's a big, strong, fast guy. By his testing numbers, by his film at Boston College, in theory, powerful enough to run inside and fast enough to run outside. That's what you want from a back. He's big enough that he can run through anyone, anywhere, at any time. That should translate to a good back, at least on paper. And on top of that, people have always said he's a better receiver than you probably think, but both the usage data and the results do not bear that out. We've taken deep dives on Aaron Jones' usage and Josh Jacobs' usage this offseason. I thought we should run the same numbers on A.J. Dillon and see what we find out. It's basically what you'd expect. Each of the past, 3 seasons, 4 seasons if you go back to his rookie year when he hardly played at all, only 119 snaps, not 100, 122, snaps, counting postseason there. But every single year, more than 90% of his snaps have been in the backfield, above 93% in 204, and above 97% as a rookie. Was not the sort of player who ever really split out wide. His career high is 24 snaps in the slot in 2022. He's a very classic running back. He just gets in the backfield and carries the ball. When he does carry the ball, primarily he's running a lot of zone carries. His zone to gap ratio is even it's less evenly split than you'd expect than Aaron Jones. You would expect that Jones would be more of the wide zone sort of player, and A.J. Dillon would be running those hard-charging gap runs inside. But really, Dillon has been a lot more consistently used as a zone runner than even Jones was. Even last year, 54% of his carries were in a zone scheme, 60% the year prior, 65% the year before that, and 83% the year before that. And I know there's inside zone and outside zone, and Dillon could have been more of an inside zone runner, but it was never really that powerful gap running that you would expect, which might be a little bit on Matt LaFleur. Maybe you should be using Dillon a little bit differently, but hey, that's what they chose to do, and he didn't execute. Even more surprising, the last 2 years, less than 50% of his carries have come on inside runs. So Pro Football Focus has a bunch of different directions they break down that your carries can go. 8 primary ones for running backs, but you can group those down to basically inside or outside runs. 45% of Dillon's runs last year were inside runs. 54%, 96 total carries went outside, so outside of tackle or end. The year prior, 49%. I'll have to go back all the way back to 2021 to find a season where he breaks 50% on inside runs. It was 61% in 2021. Not only does he not run inside all that much, his inside usage has been decreasing. And just to round it out, how's he used as a player? There are 4 different pass depths that Pro Football Focus charts: deep, medium, short, and behind the line of scrimmage in his career in 4 years. Dillon has never had a deep or medium target. They've all been short or behind the line of scrimmage. And he hasn't had an average depth of target greater than 0.2 yards downfield since 2020, when his average depth of target was 2.3 yards, and you can hardly count that because he only had 3 targets all season. When Dillon is regularly getting the ball, it's just swings and checkdowns and dump-offs. He's not been used as a dangerous receiver at all. The usage is there. We all understand it. But the results, also worth recounting here, have not been great. 4.1 per carry for his career, 3.4 per carry last year. Success rate only about 55% for his career. Never really been that effective as a receiver. Both the usage and the results, it just hasn't been there for Dillon. So as a result, to kind of tie things up after the question there, Dillon just has to have low expectations. It would kind of be silly to do anything otherwise. And I feel bad because, as our question asker pointed out a couple of times, he is a really likable guy, and you want to root for him. And the idea of him as a player is still intriguing here in year 5, even if you should know better by this point. But we've seen A.J. Dillon. We know what he does and what he's like. And I don't know what I could expect from him at this point other than very little. And that does feel mean. But he's just been the very definition of a replacement level back. And if they can get anything else from anyone else, they probably should. That's just where I come down. He's just got to be A.J. Dillon if he wants to meet expectations this year, but understanding that A.J. Dillon has not been all that much to the Packers over the first 4 years of his career. So prediction-wise, I think basically what I'm predicting is a decreasing role for Dillon, under 160 carries and under 15 catches. Those would be career lows outside of his rookie year on both of those numbers. I was tempted to lower it down to 150, but I don't know if he'll get under that, barring an injury. Moderate expectations brings us to Marshawn Lloyd. I think he's a mini Josh Jacobs in a lot of ways. Sawed-off, beefy little running back, 5'8", 5'9", 220 pounds. Some intentional redundancy, I think, there with Jacobs, but he does fit the profile of what the Packers have looked for more and more under Brian Gutekunst, a stocky, powerful back who runs strong and hard. That's Marshawn Lloyd. But moderate expectations. Top 100 pick, sure, but no one's expecting him to be the guy. Things are wide open behind Josh Jacobs. The role for the number 2 running back in Green Bay is wide open and there for the taking for anybody who would like to have it. And I think Lloyd has more pop of any backup running back for the Packers basically since Aaron Jones was a backup running back. You got to go all the way back to 2017 when he was getting treated like a guy who was maybe just like a third down change of pace back. That's really the last time we've had a backup as promising as Lloyd looks to be. Even Dillon in 2020, and part of that was due to his season being wiped out by COVID. He did not show the pop in his testing numbers on the field that we've seen from Lloyd. Admittedly, there is some shiny object syndrome here. Lloyd is new. Lloyd has fun highlights. The idea of the short, powerful running back is a fun one. It remains to be seen whether or not he has a real fit in the NFL. What is his role like as an NFL player? Can he pass protect? I know that I always say that's not something that should be a determining factor when you're drafting running backs, and I still believe that. But you can bet for sure it's going to be a determining factor as to whether or not he gets on the field for the Packers. So, can he do it? We'll see. How does he meet expectations then? I think he's got to step up and grab as much as he can. He needs to be a real addition to the backfield here as a rookie. He can't just be a guy who basically redshirts like A.J. Dillon did. Things are a lot more unsettled ahead of him than they were for A.J. Dillon in 2020. There is no Jamal Williams on the Packers right now pairing with Aaron Jones. Williams was, I think, a much better running back, number 2 back than A.J. Dillon has been. The Packers have a chance to get that again if Lloyd can step up, or someone can step up. It might as well be Lloyd. He's got to step up and grab as much of that role as he can. I do get the sense that the Packers, just the way that they've done things in the past, may want to try to phase Dillon out slowly if that's what ends up happening. And there are some ball security issues there with Marshawn Lloyd, too, that could hinder his rise a little bit, too. But just from an actual usage standpoint, if there's a chance that someone could take snaps away from Dillon, it's probably Lloyd. And the better Lloyd plays, the easier it is for the Packers to sort of diplomatically phase Dillon out. Prediction-wise, I'm going to say that Lloyd has a higher yards per carry average than A.J. Dillon does, and I also predict that he has more catches this year than Dillon. I'm not quite ready to say he'll get more carries, but I think he should siphon off quite a bit of action from Dillon. That brings us finally to Josh Jacobs. As I've said a few times over the course of this offseason, he has, if you look at the entire runway of his Packers career that he has ahead of him, he has a chance to be a historically unique player for the Packers. Really the first big-time running back signing in team history, certainly last 30 years or so of team history, probably their biggest offensive free agent ever, has a chance to be just the second guy in Packers history to make serious noise on their career leaderboards after having played somewhere else, along with Ahman Green. He could have that kind of impact in Green Bay and could go down if he plays like he has for the Raiders as one of the better backs in certainly modern Packers history, if not all time, if he stacks up as many yards as he has for the Raiders. Concordantly, our expectations are going to be high. They couldn't be anything else. He got big money. He replaces a beloved player in Aaron Jones. Expectations are going to be high. I don't think anybody would argue with that. So I think he's got to be the workhorse or bell cow or lead dog or whatever animal metaphor you prefer in the Packers backfield. He's got to be a leader in the locker room. And most importantly, he has to produce. You can do all the things about, the reputation of Josh Jacobs, what defenses think of him, how they prepare to stop him. You saw that with late career Brett Favre in a lot of instances. People, for a while there, until his late career resurgence under Mike McCarthy, he was basically an idea, like a legend more than an actual player. Because people were afraid of what he had done in the past, or at least talking publicly, they were afraid of what he'd done in the past. But on the field, it just didn't match up. He took too many chances, was too reckless, and things like that. But Jacobs can't be just a reputation. They need him to produce in a way that is commensurate with his payment. And that's a pretty high bar, but I think he can meet it, at least for this season. So I think he's going to break 1,000 yards. Let's bump that higher. I think it's 1,100 yards or bust for Jacobs this year, his first year in Green Bay. That is, I think, very achievable. I think he's going to break 300 carries, so 1,100 yards over 300 carries. That's not all that high of an average, so I think they're going to work him hard. Jacobs was signed to be used up, essentially. The Packers know that they don't have him for the freshest part of his NFL career, but the aging curve statistically for most running backs should carry him through another couple of productive years, certainly 2 or possibly 3 or more. But certainly you would think at least 2 good years out of Josh Jacobs for sure, and I think they're going to want to work him hard during that window to get as much as they can for their money before they start have to make contract decisions on his future in Green Bay. I do think he will have a pretty significant presence in the passing game. I think more than 30 catches for Jacobs, but fewer than 40. So a lot of rushing yards, maybe not a lot, but enough rushing yards, a lot of touches, 300 carries or more, and then involved in the passing game, more than 30 catches, but fewer than 40. That feels like a pretty good season for Jacobs, especially if he could get to 1,100-1,200 yards with fewer than 300 carries. If he did something like that, that I think would be a really remarkable ROI for the Packers this year. But I'm not willing to go that far quite as a prediction. But still, I think we have every reason to think that Jacobs could do that. It's just he shouldn't lack for opportunities. It's just a matter of whether or not he will be able to. The Packers certainly want him to, and he fits what they've been doing and trying to develop at running back. I'm excited to see what he actually does for the Packers this year. So I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in the conversation that you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.